If you have ever wondered what Karl Marx thought about drugs, or what his drugs of choice were, then this video is for you. First, we'll take a quick look at which drugs Marx was known to have used the most, and then I'm going to go through what Marx actually wrote about drugs, just really briefly to give an overview of what his thoughts on the politics of drug use might have been. Alright, so what drugs did Marx use? Well, the substances that Marx was known to use the most were tobacco and alcohol, and although I suspect he probably used a number of other drugs as well, it's those two that are the most often affiliated with him in descriptions by his peers and biographers. So Marx took to drinking alcohol as a teenager when he was a student in Germany, and there are a handful of stories from his peers and biographers that describe him getting astoundingly drunk, especially in the early days. For example, there's a story about Marx in which he and his colleague Edgar Bauer, as well as a few other friends of theirs, all of whom were in London at the time, were out to spend the evening together, and they agreed that they would try to drink at every single bar in a certain part of London. And so they proceeded to go from bar to bar and drink at least one drink at every bar. And of course, they were quite intoxicated by the end of this. And apparently one of them got a little rowdy and broke a street lamp. And apparently a few of the others, including Marx, thought it would be a good idea to join in, and they broke a few street lamps as they moseyed home drunk through the streets of London in the middle of the night. Not surprisingly, this attracted the attention of a police officer who proceeded to chase them. However, they all ran away and they made it away from the police officers, and they were never caught for this. Now, there was actually an extended period of Marx's life when he apparently couldn't really afford to drink a whole lot. This largely coincided with the period in which he was working on Capital, and according to accounts, he still did enjoy beer, but it seems that he didn't drink as much as he had in his younger days. However, tobacco is a drug that it seems Marx loved to consume continuously throughout his whole life, and that even when he was in abject poverty, he still smoked cigars daily. The cigars were his preferred way to smoke tobacco, and he was known to have quite an appetite for cigars. Marx apparently used to joke that the book that he was working on, The Capital, would not make him enough money to pay for the cigars that he had smoked while writing it. So perhaps that gives some insight into how much Marx loved his tobacco. But what's more interesting to me, and I think will be interesting to you too, are the various passages that Marx himself actually wrote about drugs. And because he was an economist and a political theorist, almost all of them pertain to the politics and the economics of various drug markets. I'm just going to quickly go through the more notable things that Marx did write about drugs. So, for example, in the first volume of Capital, he mentioned the British monopolies on salt, tea, opium, and betel nut as premier examples of capitalism. He also wrote at least one piece specifically about the opium trade, which was published in 1858. Now, Britain and China were in the middle of the Second Opium War at the time, so Marx was addressing the rather charged politics of the British monopoly on opium that was being sold primarily to China. And in this piece, Marx seems to be rather supportive of China's initiatives to ban the import of opium. Since the British opium trade was a stark example of capitalism and colonization, both of which Marx opposed, China's efforts to restrict the opium trade would have been justified in Marx's eyes as a matter of anti-colonial and anti-capitalist politics. This opposition to the drug trade on anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist grounds inspired later communist ideology toward drugs. But it should be noted that Marx opposed what was known in England at the time as the Beer Bill, which was a law that was only very briefly in effect that restricted the hours that bars were allowed to operate on Sundays. Marx personally attended a demonstration against this, and he also wrote a piece expressing his support for the opposition to the law, which was repealed very soon after it was implemented due to popular distaste for it and protests and whatnot. The last passage I want to draw attention to in this video is from The German Ideology, which is a book that Marx co-authored with his colleague Friedrich Engels. And in it, they reference the story of Don Quixote by Cervantes, specifically a character from the story named Sancho, who experiences a sort of drug-induced ego death while on a quest to find the Philosopher's Stone. The character encounters and consumes a magic potion that in the text is said to be brewed from rosemary, wine, olive oil, and salt. As Marx and Engels write, Sancho drinks the potion for his own self-enjoyment, but then the elixir, quote, purges him of all his egoism. That passage caught my eye because it specifically discusses the diminishment of the ego after the consumption of what is arguably a drug. So I thought it was really interesting that there is a passage by Marx and Engels that does in a way describe ego death, which of course now is a trope that's commonly associated with psychedelic drugs. And I'm not really sure what to make of it, but I thought it was worth noting. I think it fits into my small collection of passages by Marx about drug use. So that's all for now. I hope you learned something from this video. If you like it and you know other drug nerds, politics nerds, feel free to share. You can read more over on my Substack, highandmighty.substack.com, and a lot of this material will be included in my forthcoming book, High and Mighty: How People in Power Use Drugs. Thanks for watching. Peace.